Hello, and welcome to the Program Monitoring Validation Training for Title I Part C Migrant Education Program. First, we would like to share some things to keep in mind regarding this program monitoring validation process. Please note that documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. Another thing to note is to ensure overall compliance with program requirements. LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. In addition, please keep in mind that the documentation requested for submission during the program monitoring validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. If meeting documentation is to be provided for any requirement, please consider the following. The standard meeting documentation that an LEA should maintain locally includes meeting agendas, meeting notes and/or minutes, and sign-in sheets. Please note that documentation for virtual meetings is an acceptable form of documentation. Given the increased use of virtual meeting environments, participant rosters that include the meeting title, meeting date, and stakeholder names and roles would be an acceptable substitute for the more traditional sign-in sheets. This eliminates the need for a participant signature. We want to provide you with some additional guidance regarding the documentation requested as part of this year's program monitoring validation for the Title I Part C program. We will only be accepting documentation for the previous school year to ensure that TA is provided with adequate documentation to support the selected requirement.
This section includes an overview of the identification and recruitment requirements included as part of the program monitoring validation process. Identification and recruitment. The LEA identifies and recruits migratory children and youth, including OSY, according to the specific timelines and guidance outlined in the Texas Manual for Identification and Recruitment of Migratory Children, in order to ensure the accuracy of such information. Migratory child eligibility requirement defined in Section 1309-2-5. Documentation required. 1.1 Recruiter logs. The acceptable documentation for this requirement is a minimum of 2 and no more than 4 sample recruiter logs from the prior school year. This can include any form of recruiter logs used as a way to capture recruitment activities. Again, for 1.1, the documentation is a minimum of 2, but no more than 4 sample recruiter logs from the prior school year. Some issues that may result in improvement needed status could include the following. Audible documentation requested was not submitted. Documentation submitted does not reference recruiter logs. Documentation submitted was not for activities that took place in the prior year. Documentation required. 1.2 Reviewer logs. The acceptable documentation for this requirement is a minimum of 2, but no more than 4 sample reviewer logs showing that quality control took place. It's really important that when providing this documentation, it's evident that quality control is taking place when reviewers are reviewing COEs. For documentation requirement 1.2, again, the acceptable documentation is a minimum of 2, but no more than 4 sample reviewer logs from the prior school year showing quality control took place. Some of the issues that may result in an improvement needed status are the following. Audible documentation requested was not submitted. Documentation submitted doesn't reference the reviewer logs. Documentation doesn't show evidence that quality control took place. Documentation submitted was not for an activity that took place in the prior school year. Required documentation 1.3 Identification and Recruitment Action Plan. The acceptable documentation for this requirement is a copy of the IDR action plan from the prior year that includes quality control procedures for IDR. Here we're stressing the quality control again. We want to make sure that whenever we are reviewing those action plans, we see the steps that really indicate that good practices when it comes to recruitment are taking place, including that quality control. So it's really important that your action plans reflect the need for the quality of the documentation. Again, the required documentation for 1.3 is a copy of the LEA's IDR action plan that includes quality control procedures for IDR. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status are the following. The audible documentation requested was not submitted. Documentation submitted doesn't include quality control procedures in your IDR action plan, or the documentation submitted was not for activities that took place in the prior year.
Thank you for your participation in this overview of the program monitoring validation process for the Title I Part C Migrant Education Program.